My mom called me sobbing. Your father's in the hospital. We need $12,000 for surgery. I rushed over with the money. At the hospital, I found Dad playing poker with his friends in the cafeteria. The surgery was cosmetic hair plugs. I walked up to the cashier, canceled the payment, and left Dad with a $12,000 bill he couldn't cover. I, 34M, thought I knew my father. 34 years of watching him work construction, watching him count every dollar twice before spending it, watching him lecture me about financial responsibility. The man who made me return a candy bar I'd stolen when I was 8 because integrity matters more than sugar. The same man who just cost me $12,000 and taught me that blood doesn't always run thicker than greed. It started 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed. Mom's contact photo filled the screen, but when I answered, the voice that came through was barely recognizable. She was sobbing so hard I could barely make out the words. Something about Dad being in the hospital, emergency surgery, and needing money immediately. My heart dropped into my stomach. Dad had been complaining about chest pains for months, but being the stubborn man he was, he'd refused to see a doctor. I'd been after him constantly to get checked out, and now my worst fears seemed to be coming true. Mom managed to choke out that they needed $12,000 for the surgery and that their insurance wouldn't cover it. The procedure had to happen today, she said, or they might lose him. I didn't even hesitate. I told her I'd be there within the hour with the money. I drove to the bank in a panic, my hands shaking as I filled out the withdrawal slip. $12,000 was a significant chunk of my savings, but it was my father's life. The teller looked concerned when she saw the amount, asking if everything was okay. I explained it was a medical emergency, and she processed the withdrawal with sympathetic efficiency. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Every red light seemed to last forever. Every slow driver in front of me became a personal enemy. I kept thinking about all the things I should have said to Dad, all the conversations we'd put off, all the time I'd wasted being busy with work instead of spending time with family. When I finally reached the hospital, I rushed through the automatic doors with the envelope of cash clutched in my sweating palm. The sterile smell of disinfectant hit me immediately, and the fluorescent lights seemed too bright, too harsh. I approached the information desk, ready to ask about my father's surgery, when something caught my eye. Through the glass doors of the cafeteria, I saw a familiar figure. My father was sitting at a round table with 3 other men, all of them hunched over playing cards. There were poker chips scattered across the table, and Dad was laughing at something one of his buddies had said. He looked perfectly healthy, perfectly relaxed, and absolutely not like someone who was supposed to be in emergency surgery. I stood there for a full minute, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe it was someone who just looked like my father. But no, there was no mistaking that laugh, that gesture he made when he was bluffing, that way he tilted his head when he was concentrating on his cards. I walked closer to the cafeteria, my legs feeling like they were moving through thick mud. Through the glass, I could see Dad clearly now. He was wearing his favorite flannel shirt, the one with the small tear near the left pocket that Mom had been trying to get him to throw away for years. His color looked good, his breathing seemed normal, and he was clearly enjoying himself. One of his poker buddies noticed me first and nudged Dad, pointing in my direction. When Dad looked up and saw me standing there with the envelope in my hand, his face went through a series of expressions. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked suspiciously like guilt. He excused himself from the table and walked over to where I was standing. I asked him what was going on, why he was playing poker when he was supposed to be in surgery. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he used to do when I caught him sneaking cookies before dinner when I was a kid. He explained that he was getting a procedure done, but it wasn't exactly emergency surgery. When I pressed him for details, he admitted it was cosmetic surgery. Hair plugs, to be specific. He'd been losing his hair for years, and it had been bothering him more than he'd let on. He'd finally decided to do something about it, but he knew Mom would never approve of spending that kind of money on vanity. I asked him why he'd lied, why he'd made Mom call me sobbing about emergency surgery. He said he hadn't meant for it to go that far, but once Mom found out about the procedure, she'd panicked and assumed the worst. Instead of correcting her, he decided to go along with it because he knew I'd help with the money if I thought it was life-threatening. The casual way he explained his deception made my blood boil. He'd manipulated both Mom and me, playing on our love and fear to fund his cosmetic procedure. He'd made me drive across town in a panic, withdraw my savings, and rush to what I thought was my father's deathbed. Also, he could get hair plugs and play poker with his friends while he waited. I asked him if he had any idea what he'd put us through. He shrugged and said it wasn't that big a deal, that I could afford it, and that he'd pay me back eventually. The way he said "eventually" made it clear that he had no real intention of repaying the money anytime soon, if ever. I looked at this man who'd raised me, who'd taught me about honesty and integrity, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. The father I'd respected and admired had just revealed himself to be someone willing to lie and manipulate his own family for personal gain. I told him I needed to think about this and walked away, leaving him standing there looking confused and slightly annoyed. I found a quiet corner of the hospital and sat down to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, asking if I'd made it to the hospital okay and if Dad was going to be all right. I stared at that text for a long time. Mom was probably sitting at home, worried sick about her husband, having no idea that he was perfectly fine and playing cards with his buddies. She was probably blaming herself for not forcing him to see a doctor sooner, probably praying that the surgery would go well. That's when I made my decision. I walked to the hospital's billing department and asked to speak with someone about my father's procedure. The clerk was helpful and pulled up his account on her computer. I explained that there had been a misunderstanding about the payment and that I needed to cancel the payment arrangement I'd made. She looked confused and told me that no payment had been processed yet. I realized that Dad had probably been planning to use my cash to pay for the procedure directly, avoiding any paper trail that might lead back to him. I told her that was fine, that the family had decided not to proceed with the payment assistance after all. I walked back to the cafeteria, where Dad was still playing poker. I approached his table and set the envelope of cash down in front of him. I told him that I'd spoken with billing and that he was on his own for the payment. His face went pale as he realized what I was saying. He asked what I meant, and I explained that since this wasn't the medical emergency he'd led us to believe, I wasn't going to fund his cosmetic procedure. If he wanted hair plugs, he could figure out how to pay for them himself. I suggested he might want to call Mom and explain the real situation before she worried herself sick. One of his poker buddies asked what was going on, and Dad mumbled something about a family misunderstanding. I could see the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how he was going to come up with $12,000 on short notice. I left the hospital feeling a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that might have been satisfaction. Dad had taught me that actions have consequences, and now he was about to learn that lesson himself. Update 1. The fallout began within hours. Dad called me that evening, his voice tight with panic. He explained that the procedure was scheduled for the next morning and that he'd already signed contracts with the clinic. If he couldn't pay, he'd be liable for cancellation fees and potentially legal action. I listened to him plead his case, but I remained firm. I told him that he'd made his choice when he decided to lie and manipulate us, and now he had to live with the consequences. He tried several different approaches, alternating between guilt trips about family loyalty and promises that he'd learned his lesson. When those didn't work, he got angry. He accused me of being vindictive and cruel, of abandoning family when they needed help. I reminded him that this wasn't a family emergency. It was a cosmetic procedure that he'd chosen to pursue through deception. Mom called me later that night, confused and upset. Dad had finally told her the truth about the surgery, and she was struggling to process it all. She said she felt foolish for panicking and embarrassed that she'd called me in such a state over hair plugs. I assured her that she wasn't the one who should feel embarrassed. She'd reacted exactly as any loving wife would when told her husband needed emergency surgery. The fault lay entirely with Dad for creating the deception in the first place. Mom asked if I was really going to let Dad deal with this financial mess on his own. I told her that I was, and I explained my reasoning. Dad needed to understand that his actions had consequences, and that he couldn't manipulate people just because they loved him. Update 2. The next morning, Dad showed up at my office. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept all night. He'd been calling around trying to get a loan, but his credit wasn't good enough for an unsecured $12,000 loan on such short notice. He begged me to reconsider, promising that he'd pay me back with interest. He said he'd already taken time off work for the recovery and that he'd lose his deposit if he canceled now. I could see the desperation in his eyes, but I held firm. I told him that if the procedure was really that important to him, he should have been honest from the beginning. He could have asked for help without lying, could have explained why he wanted the surgery and let us make an informed decision about whether to help. Instead, he'd chosen to manipulate and deceive, and that choice had consequences. I wasn't going to reward his behavior by bailing him out when his plan fell apart. Dad left my office angry and defeated. I felt a pang of guilt watching him walk away, but I reminded myself that this was a lesson he needed to learn. At 62 years old, he was old enough to understand that lying to family wasn't acceptable, regardless of the reason. That afternoon, I got a call from one of Dad's poker buddies. He'd heard about the situation and wanted to know if I was really going to let Dad suffer over what he called a little white lie. I explained that there was nothing little or white about manipulating your family's emotions to fund a cosmetic procedure. The poker buddy suggested that maybe Dad had learned his lesson and that I should consider helping him out. I thanked him for his concern, but made it clear that this was a family matter and that my decision was final. Update 3. 3 days later, Mom called with an update. Dad had managed to get a personal loan, but the interest rate was astronomical. He'd have to work extra hours for the next 2 years to pay it off, and the monthly payments would strain their budget significantly. The hair plug procedure had been postponed while Dad sorted out the financing, and he was miserable about the whole situation. Mom said he'd been sulking around the house, barely speaking to anyone, and clearly regretting his choices. Part of me felt bad about Dad's financial predicament, but a larger part of me felt vindicated. He was finally experiencing the real cost of his deception, and maybe that would make him think twice before trying something like this again. Mom asked if I thought I was being too harsh. I told her that I didn't think so, that Dad had made a calculated decision to lie and manipulate us, and that he needed to face the consequences of that choice. She sighed and said she understood my position, even if she wished things could have been handled differently. She admitted that she was disappointed in Dad's behavior and that she'd lost some trust in him over the whole incident. 2 weeks later, Dad finally called me. His voice was subdued, lacking the usual confidence and bluster I was used to hearing. He said he wanted to apologize for lying to me and for putting Mom through unnecessary worry. He admitted that he'd been wrong to deceive us and that he understood why I'd refused to help once I learned the truth. He said the experience had taught him a valuable lesson about honesty and the importance of family trust. I appreciated the apology, but I told him that words were easy and that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent honest behavior. He agreed and said he was committed to being more transparent in the future. The hair plug procedure eventually happened, funded by Dad's high-interest loan. The results were decent, though not spectacular, and Dad seemed pleased with his new hairline. More importantly, he seemed to have learned something about the cost of deception. Our relationship slowly began to heal over the following months. Dad made an effort to be more honest and transparent, and I gradually started to trust him again. The incident had damaged our relationship, but it had also clarified some important boundaries about honesty and manipulation. Looking back, I don't regret my decision to leave Dad with the bill. He'd made a choice to lie and manipulate his family, and he needed to face the consequences of that choice. Sometimes the people we love need to learn hard lessons, and sometimes we have to be the ones to teach them. The $12,000 I'd withdrawn that day went back into my savings account, but the lesson learned was worth far more than any amount of money. Trust, once broken, is expensive to repair, and Dad paid that price in full.